Sarah Johnson, a 28-year-old nurse, sat at the small kitchen table in her rented apartment. A pile of bills seemed to grow larger by the day. Power outage notices, late rent payments, and credit card charges filled her vision as she rested her head in her hands. She sighed deeply, feeling the weight of each responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. The nearly empty refrigerator and the worn clothes she wore were a reflection of how complicated her life had become. Sarah worked at a community clinic, where the shifts were exhausting and poorly paid. She loved helping people, but her salary was not enough to cover even half of her expenses. In addition, she had been experiencing a series of dizziness and weaknesses lately that worried her. However, doctor appointments were out of the question. How could she afford to see a doctor if she could barely keep the lights on? That day, after another shift, she picked up the yellow newspaper that was on the table. It was a habit she'd maintained, flipping through the classifieds, looking for something, anything, that might offer a chance for a change. Her eyes skimmed the ads, almost giving up, until one line caught her eye. Home care nurse wanted. Good pay. Immediate availability. She reread the ads several times, her heart pounding with each word. The job sounded promising, but it required experience with critically ill patients and a willingness to live on site. Sarah hesitated. It might be too dangerous or too difficult, but she had no choice. The bills were still there, staring at her like a cruel reminder that she needed to act. Before she could decide, her phone vibrated on her desk. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered hopefully. Hello. Her voice was hesitant. A woman with a firm, authoritative tone answered. Are you Sarah Johnson? We need a nurse for my husband. It's urgent. Can you come in today for an interview? Sarah blinked, surprised by the urgency. She didn't remember applying for that job, but she'd sent out so many resumes lately that it wasn't impossible. Yes, of course. Where and what time? The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret Williams, gave the address of a mansion in an upscale neighborhood and quickly ended the call. Sarah stared at the phone, still absorbing what had just happened. With a mix of fear and hope, she stood up. Maybe this was the chance she'd been waiting for. Sarah could still feel her heart racing as she prepared for the interview. She put on the only clean uniform she had, fixed her hair, and checked her simple, straightforward resume. Despite her nervousness, something inside her told her she couldn't waste this opportunity. Her thoughts returned to the bills on the table. I need this job, she muttered to herself like a mantra. As she left the house, the day seemed to reflect her mood. The sky was overcast and the cold wind made her huddle inside her thin coat. Sarah walked to the nearest bus stop, feeling the slight dizziness that had been bothering her for the past few days. Not now, she whispered as she gripped the handrail for support. Taking a deep breath, she boarded the bus that would take her to the upscale neighborhood. The contrast between where she lived and her final destination was striking. Stepping off the bus, Sarah stood in front of a black iron gate with intricate detailing. Behind it was an imposing mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. She took another deep breath, trying to contain her nervousness. She was greeted by a serious security guard who, after checking her name against a list, led her to a side entrance. When the large wooden doors opened, Sarah was struck by the interior of the house. The marble floors gleamed in the light of the crystal chandeliers, and the silence was almost oppressive. An elegant woman with a rigid posture and piercing eyes approached. It was Margaret Williams, the patient's wife. You must be Sarah Johnson, Margaret said, sizing her up and down. My husband is in serious condition. We have no time to waste. I want to know if you are capable of handling delicate cases. Sarah tried to maintain her composure as she answered. I've worked with patients in critical situations, and I'm willing to learn whatever it takes to meet his needs. Margaret frowned, seemingly weighing Sarah's words. After a few seconds of awkward silence, she nodded. Come with me. I want to introduce you to my husband. Sarah followed Margaret down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The luxurious surroundings were intimidating, but her determination to change her life kept her going. As they entered the master bedroom, Sarah saw Mr. Williams for the first time. He was lying on a large bed, his pale skin a stark contrast to the dark brown hair on his face. The crisp sheets, his breathing was heavy, and his tired eyes watched the two women. Mr. Williams, Margaret said, her tone serious. This is Sarah. She will be your new nurse, if that's okay with you. He turned his head slowly to look at Sarah, and a shiver ran down her spine. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Williams, she said with an encouraging smile. Despite his frailty, he managed a small smile and murmured, "Thank you for coming." Sarah felt, in that moment, that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Sarah felt the weight of Mr. Williams's gaze as he tried to speak, but a loud cough stopped him. She quickly approached, taking his hand carefully. "You don't have to worry, Mr. Williams. I'm here to help in any way you need." He nodded slightly, breathing hard, while Margaret watched her suspiciously. "I'll get the paperwork ready to formalize your employment. You'll be staying at the mansion full-time," Margaret announced. "There's a room prepared for you on the servants' floor. I'll have someone show you the way." Margaret left the room without asking questions, leaving Sarah alone with Mr. Williams. She looked around, taking in the luxurious yet cold surroundings. The room was large, with tall windows covered by heavy drapes and solid wood furniture. The air smelled faintly of medicine mixed with the expensive perfume that seemed to permeate the entire house. Sarah picked up the stethoscope she had brought and approached Mr. Williams again. "Let's check your heart," she said gently. He nodded slightly. As she checked his vital signs, Sarah noticed that he was weaker than he looked. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and each breath seemed like an immense effort. After completing the preliminary exam, she jotted down a few notes in her notebook. She was relieved that she had managed to remain calm during her first interaction with the patient. However, something about the house made her uneasy. It wasn't just Mr. Williams' condition, but also the tense atmosphere that seemed to hang in the air, especially around Margaret. Soon, a young butler appeared at the door. He introduced himself as Thomas and showed her to the room that would be hers. As she passed through the hallways, Sarah noticed the eyes of the other servants following her furtively, as if they were assessing the newcomer. The room was simple compared to the rest of the house, but it was clean and functional. There was a single bed, a small wardrobe, and a window that looked out onto the property's vast garden. As she unpacked her suitcase, which consisted of a few clothes and basic toiletries, Sarah felt the dizziness return. She held onto the edge of the bed to steady herself, breathing deeply until the feeling passed. "I need to get this sorted out soon," she muttered to herself. As she stood up, she heard a knock on the door. It was Thomas again. "Miss Margaret has asked you to come to the kitchen for dinner. Afterwards, she wants to talk to you about your responsibilities." Sarah thanked him and continued down the hallway, trying to memorize the route. As she passed through the main room, she saw Margaret sitting on an elegant sofa, reading something with a closed expression. She wasn't called, so she headed towards the kitchen. When she arrived, she found a table set with exquisite dishes, something she had never seen up close. A cook named Nancy served a simple but well-prepared meal. "Don't worry, dear," Nancy said with a friendly smile. "You'll get used to this place soon. Just be careful with Margaret." The phrase stayed in Sarah's mind as she finished her meal in silence. It was only the first day, but the mansion was already full of mysteries. After dinner, Sarah was called by Margaret for a formal talk about her responsibilities. As she listened to the strict rules and controlled tone of her mistress, an uneasy feeling grew inside her. This house hid more secrets than she could imagine. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. She sat up in bed, still groggy from the fatigue and dizziness that had plagued her for the last few days. Despite this, she got up, put on her uniform, and headed to Mr. Williams's room to begin her first day of work. Opening the door to his room, Sarah found Mr. Williams in a chair by the window, wrapped in a thick blanket. He seemed to be looking out at the garden, but his gaze was lost, as if he were carrying an invisible burden. "Good morning, Mr. Williams. How are you feeling today?" Sarah asked softly. He turned slowly and replied with a weak smile. "I'm still here, so I suppose that's a positive thing." Sarah smiled back, trying to break the ice as she organized her materials for monitoring his vital signs. As she was checking his blood pressure and temperature, Margaret suddenly entered the room with firm steps and a stern expression. "Remember, Sarah, the job here is not just to take care of his health. I want this room to be spotless, and you must report any changes in his condition directly to me. Sarah nodded, controlling the discomfort she felt at Margaret's authoritative tone. Of course, Mrs. Williams. I will do whatever is necessary. When Margaret left, Mr. Williams sighed and muttered, "Don't take her so seriously. Margaret has a peculiar way of dealing with things." He then changed the subject, asking Sarah to help him back to bed. As she performed the procedure, Sarah noticed how fragile he was. Each movement seemed to require tremendous effort, and she had to be extremely careful. "It's okay. Take your time," she said as she helped him. Despite the difficulties, Mr. Williams showed patience and thanked her with a smile. As the day went on, Sarah began to familiarize herself with the routine at the mansion. Between medication, meal times, and supervision, she also had the chance to observe the behavior of the other staff more closely. Nancy, the cook, was warm and friendly, while Thomas, the butler, kept a low profile but always seemed preoccupied. Other staff avoided direct contact, as if they were always too busy to interact. During a break, Sarah found Nancy in the kitchen and decided to ask her something that had been bothering her. "Nancy, do you know why there's so much tension in this house? It seems like everyone is always walking on eggshells." Nancy glanced around, making sure no one else was around, before answering in a low tone. "This mansion has many stories, dear. Not all of them happy. Margaret controls everything with an iron fist, and Mr. Williams, well, he's always been a kind man, but I think he carries secrets that weigh too heavily. Just be careful, okay?" Sarah nodded, sensing that there was much more to this house than she could see. Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas, who hurried in. "Sarah, Mrs. Margaret wants to see you in her office." "Now." Thomas's serious tone made Sarah's heart race. "Thank you. I'll be right there," she replied, trying to hide her nervousness. As she made her way upstairs to Margaret's office, she couldn't help but feel that something important was about to happen. Upon entering the office, Sarah found Margaret standing next to a stack of papers. "Sarah," Margaret began bluntly, "I want you to sign this contract now. It formalizes your stay here and ensures that you understand the rules of this house." Sarah read the document carefully. It was stricter than she had expected, requiring complete confidentiality regarding anything she witnessed or heard while she was there. Hesitantly, but with no other choice, she signed, knowing that this contract was the door to an opportunity that could change her life, for better or worse. With the contract signed, Sarah began to feel the weight of the expectations that came with the job. Margaret's strict rules felt suffocating, but Mr. Williams's kind, grateful gaze gave her the motivation to continue. But the feeling that something was not right in the mansion grew stronger with each passing day. That evening, after another long shift of caring for Mr. Williams, Sarah decided to go out for some air. The garden seemed to be the only place where she could breathe without feeling Margaret's critical gaze. As she walked through the rose bushes, she noticed a figure in the distance. It was Thomas, the butler, kneeling beside a tree. He seemed to be fiddling with something on the ground. "Thomas?" Sarah called, puzzled. He stood up quickly, looking nervous. "Oh, Sarah, I didn't know you were here. I was just taking care of something for Mrs. Margaret," he said hesitantly. Sarah frowned, but decided not to press the issue. "Okay, good night, Thomas." As she walked away, she sensed that he was hiding something, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The next morning, at breakfast, Margaret was more controlling than ever. "Sarah, I need you to keep Mr. Williams on bed rest today. I don't want him to leave the room for any reason." "Understood, Mrs. Williams," Sarah replied, though she was confused by the order. Mr. Williams seemed eager to move around more, but Margaret clearly had other plans. When Sarah went into the room to check the patient's vital signs, she found him looking through an old photo album. "Memories of better days," he said with a wistful smile. Sarah approached, curious. "Do you mind if I look?" she asked. He nodded, and she sat down next to him. The photos showed a young, energetic man surrounded by happy-looking people. "Who are these people?" Sarah asked. He pointed to a woman with blonde hair and a bright smile. "That was my sister, Emily. We lost touch years ago. One of my biggest regrets." Sarah heard the sadness in his voice. "Why did you two drift apart?" He hesitated before answering, as if choosing his words carefully. Things got complicated when there were disputes over the family inheritance. Emily and I went our separate ways, and Margaret, she never really liked her. Before he could continue, Margaret burst into the room. Her eyes went straight to the photo album, and her expression hardened. "What's going on here?" she asked sharply. "I was just showing Sarah some memories," Mr. Williams said, trying to smooth things over. "He needs to rest," Margaret interrupted, slamming the photo album shut. "Sarah, don't distract my husband with such useless things." Sarah nodded, but was unsettled by Margaret's overreaction. After she left, Mr. Williams sighed deeply. "I'm sorry about that. Margaret, she has a peculiar way of dealing with things," he repeated, his tone bordering on despair. As the day went on, Sarah began to notice more and more strange things in the mansion. The behavior of the servants, always cautious in Margaret's presence, and the whispers in the hallways left her more and more intrigued. That night, when everyone seemed to be asleep, Sarah decided to leave her room and explore the house. She felt she needed to understand what was happening there. As she walked through the dark hallways, she heard muffled voices coming from Margaret's office. Approaching cautiously, she heard something that made her freeze. "This can't go on, Margaret. If he finds out the truth, everything will fall apart." It was Thomas, speaking urgently. Margaret replied coldly, "Don't worry, Thomas. I have everything under control. Sarah is here to take care of him, not to ask questions. As long as she stays in line, we won't have any problems." Sarah quickly walked away, feeling her heart race. They were hiding something big, and now she knew that her presence here was more important than she had ever imagined. The next morning, Sarah tried to remain calm as she went about her daily routine, but the words she had heard the night before echoed in her mind. Margaret and Thomas were clearly hiding something, but what could it be? Even as her curiosity grew, Sarah knew she needed to focus on her work, especially on Mr. Williams, who seemed frilier by the day. When she entered his room, she found him staring out the window again, lost in thought. "Good morning, Mr. Williams," Sarah said with a smile. He turned slowly, and the tired expression on his face softened a little when he saw her. "Good morning, my dear nurse," he replied, his voice husky but friendly. I was just thinking, sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if things had been different." Sarah sat down next to him, adjusting the pillows to make him more comfortable. "We all think about it from time to time," she said. "But what matters is what we do with the time we have left." Mr. Williams smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "You have a good heart, Sarah. Not everyone in this house can say the same." Sarah hesitated before asking, "Do you think there's something wrong here? I sense there's a lot of tension in the house." He stared at her for a moment, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, he sighed. "Sarah, there are a lot of things I'd like to change about my past, but some choices can't be undone. Margaret has always been very protective, sometimes too much so. I just want you to know that if anything seems off, you should trust your instincts." Before Sarah could respond, the door burst open, and Margaret walked in with her usual stiff posture. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, in a tone that clearly indicated otherwise. "I want to check in on him today. His vitals are stable, but he needs to stay on his medications on schedule," Sarah replied professionally. Margaret nodded, but there was something in her gaze that made Sarah uncomfortable. "Good. Now, Sarah, I need you to come with me to discuss some administrative matters. Don't be long." After Margaret left, Mr. Williams gently took Sarah's hand. "Watch her," he said, his expression serious. Sarah was surprised by the warning, but nodded before leaving the room. As she followed Margaret into the office, Sarah felt the tension rise. She sat down at the desk as Margaret began to talk about additional rules. "I want you to record everything that happens to my husband, every detail. And remember, your only choice is to keep a record of everything that happens to my husband. My responsibility is to keep you comfortable and follow my instructions. Nothing more." Sarah sensed the controlling tone and calmly replied, "Understood, Mrs. Williams." After the meeting, Sarah returned to Mr. Williams's room. He seemed more relaxed now, so she took the opportunity to try to distract him. "Do you want to tell me more about your sister, Emily?" she asked, remembering the photos in the album. He smiled, but there was a wistfulness in his expression. "Emily was my best friend when we were young. She always supported me, even when no one else believed in me. But after Margaret came into my life, things changed. There were conflicts, and we eventually drifted apart. Sarah sensed there was more to the story, but decided not to press. Instead, she encouraged him to rest while she tidied his room. As she left, she met Thomas in the hallway, carrying a tray. "Is Mr. Williams okay?" he asked, his tone genuine. "Yes, he's resting now," Sarah replied. She hesitated, but then decided to ask, "Thomas, you've worked here for a long time, haven't you? What's really going on in this house?" Thomas seemed to want to say something, but then he glanced around nervously and muttered, "Be careful, Sarah. Not everything is what it seems here." He hurried away, leaving Sarah even more intrigued. This house was full of secrets, and Sarah had a feeling she was getting closer and closer to finding out what was really going on. In the days that followed, Sarah continued her routine of caring for Mr. Williams, but the weight of the mansion's secrets seemed to increase with each passing moment. Every interaction with Margaret was tense, while Thomas avoided any lengthy conversation. Sarah felt like she was walking a fine line, but concern for Mr. Williams' well-being kept her steady. One night, after a silent dinner, Sarah heard a faint call coming from Mr. Williams' room. Upon entering, she found him awake, staring at the ceiling with an expression that mixed sadness and determination. "Sarah, please sit here," he said, pointing to a chair beside the bed. She did as he asked, noticing that his voice was hoarse and more tired than usual. "I need to ask you something very important," he began, gently taking her hand. "You've been more than a nurse to me. You've been my friend, my confidant, and perhaps the only person I can trust in this house." Sarah was taken aback by his words, but she kept her gaze fixed on his. "Of course, Mr. Williams. What do you need?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to continue. "I know my days are numbered, Sarah. My health is failing, and I can't ignore that. But there's something I need to do before I go. Something that could change everything." "Tell me, sir," Sarah urged, concerned about the gravity of the moment. "I need you to pretend to be my daughter," he said, with an intensity that made Sarah catch her breath. "What?" she asked, not believing what she had just heard. "Please hear me out," he continued, squeezing her hand lightly. "There is a reason for this. Margaret and the others think I am weaker than I am. They want to pressure me into making rash decisions about my will, but I want things done right. I want my true wishes to be respected." Sarah felt her heart race. "But why me, sir? Why ask something so unusual?" He looked deeply into her eyes and replied, "Because I trust you. And there is something else you need to know, but only when the time is right. Please, Sarah, do this for me." She was silent, trying to process his request. It was so unexpected, so out of character, that she hardly knew what to say. But as she looked into Mr. Williams's weary face, she saw the sincerity and urgency in his eyes. He was asking this not on a whim, but because he truly believed it was necessary. I will do what I can, sir," she replied hesitantly, but firmly. Visible relief passed over Mr. Williams's face. "Thank you, Sarah. This means more to me than you know." That night, as she tried to sleep, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the request. Why had he wanted her to pretend to be his daughter? What were Margaret and the others really planning? It seemed more and more that Mr. Williams was a central figure in a game full of secrets and hidden agendas. And now, Sarah was part of it, too. One thing was clear, though. She was determined to help him, no matter what it took. Little did Sarah know that this decision would change her life forever. The next morning, Sarah woke up with her mind still full of doubts about Mr. Williams' request. Despite her discomfort, she felt she had no choice but to go through with it. He trusted her, and she couldn't let him down. After organizing her supplies, she went straight to his room for the first assessment of the day. As soon as she entered, she found Margaret standing beside the bed, her arms crossed and her expression stern as ever. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. "We need to talk, Sarah," Margaret replied, ignoring the greeting. Her cold tone made Sarah freeze for a moment. "I want you to know that this house has its rules, and I expect you to follow them to the letter. My husband needs care, but most of all, he needs peace. Do not influence him with your ideas or opinions. Understand?" Sarah nodded, remaining calm, but but her blood boiled inside. Margaret was clearly trying to establish control, perhaps afraid that she would find out something. "Of course, Mrs. Margaret. My focus is only on taking care of Mr. Williams," Sarah replied, hiding any sign of nervousness. As Margaret left the room, Mr. Williams took Sarah's hand, as he had the night before. "She is suspicious, but don't worry. Just stick to the plan." "I have so many questions, sir," Sarah said quietly. "Why is she so concerned about the will? Is there something I should know?" He sighed, staring out the window for a few seconds before answering. "Margaret is trying to protect herself. There is a secret in this family, Sarah. Something that changes everything. And when the time comes, you will understand." Before they could continue, the door suddenly opened, and Margaret walked in again, accompanied by a man in a suit. He was carrying a briefcase and seemed embarrassed by the tense atmosphere in the room. "Mr. Williams, this is the family solicitor, Mr. Carter," Margaret said, gesturing for him to come closer. "We need to finalize the review of the will. It is an urgent matter." "I don't see what the rush is," Mr. Williams replied, his tone firm, though his voice was weak. "I want to discuss this later." Margaret frowned, clearly irritated. "Later may be too late, my dear. We need to make sure everything is in order." Sarah watched the exchange closely, feeling the tension rise with each word. She could tell Mr. Williams was resisting, but Margaret didn't seem willing to give up. Suddenly, Margaret turned to Sarah. "You are excused for now. I have private matters to discuss with my husband." Sarah hesitated, but knew she couldn't confront her right now. "Of course, Mistress Margaret," she replied, leaving the room. Outside, she found Thomas in the hallway, carrying a tray. He stopped when he saw her, looking nervous. "Sarah, are you okay?" "I don't know, Thomas. There's something very wrong here," she said quietly. He glanced around to make sure no one was around before replying. "Sarah, I need to tell you something, but not here. Meet me in the garden tonight, after everyone has gone to bed." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the mystery grow ever heavier. The day seemed endless, with each interaction revealing more layers of intrigue. That night, as agreed, Sarah went to the garden. Thomas was already there, in the shade of a tree. He looked uneasy, but determined to speak. "Sarah, you need to know the truth," he began, looking directly at her. "Margaret is hiding something about Mr. Williams. Something that could change everything." "What are you talking about, Thomas?" Sarah asked anxiously. "He has a daughter," he replied, almost whispering. "A daughter that Margaret tried to erase from history. And I think you have more to do with it than you realize." Sarah felt her heart race. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the full truth still seemed just out of reach. She knew, however, that she was about to learn secrets that could change her life, and Mr. Williams's forever. Sarah froze at Thomas's words. A daughter? That explained so many things. Margaret's secrets, her distrust, and Mr. Williams's unexpected request. "Are you sure about this, Thomas? Why has this daughter never been mentioned before?" Thomas looked around, as if afraid of being overheard, and answered in a low tone. Margaret did everything she could to erase any trace of her. Mr. Williams was very close to his daughter, but Margaret, well, she had other plans. "I don't know the details, but there's something more. Sarah, I think you need to know the truth." Sarah's heart raced. "And how do I find out the truth, Thomas? No one here trusts me." He hesitated before continuing. "There's a box in Margaret's office with old documents. I've seen her hiding papers there. It might be your only chance to find out everything." Despite her fear, Sarah knew she couldn't ignore this information. That night, she waited until everything was quiet in the mansion. With careful steps, she made her way to Margaret's office. The door was ajar, and she stepped inside. She quickly closed the door behind her. The office was luxurious, with dark furniture and a seemingly endless bookcase. Sarah went to her desk and began rummaging through it. After a few minutes, she found a small locked box. She looked around and found the key in a side drawer. With shaking hands, she opened the box. Inside were a collection of documents, certificates, letters, and an old photograph. In the photo, Mr. Williams was holding a baby in his arms, and next to him was a blonde woman Sarah recognized from his stories, Emily, his sister. One letter in particular caught her eye. It was a handwritten apology from Mr. Williams, addressed to his daughter, whose existence Sarah was now beginning to understand. Please forgive me for not being the father you needed. I hope one day we can meet and make this right, the letter read. At the end, the signature almost brought Sarah to her knees. To my dear Sarah. Her breath caught. What did that mean? There was no way she could be his daughter? Or was she? Suddenly, all the pieces began to fall into place. Mr. Williams knew. He had known all along. Before he could process it all, he heard footsteps in the hallway. He quickly closed the box and put everything away. Margaret entered the office, looking around with suspicious eyes. Sarah, what are you doing here? I was looking for a notepad. I wanted to write down something important about Mr. Williams, she replied, trying to sound calm. Margaret didn't look convinced, but she didn't insist. Get out. This is no place for you, she said coldly. Sarah went back to her room, her heart pounding. She needed to confirm the truth with Mr. Williams. The next morning, she went to his room earlier than usual. He was awake, looking calm, as if he had been waiting for her. Sir, I need to ask you something, Sarah began hesitantly. I know what you want to know, he said, interrupting her gently. Yes, Sarah, you are my daughter. The words hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. Tears began to stream down her face as she tried to absorb the revelation. But how? Why didn't you ever tell me? He held her hand, his gaze filled with sadness. I wasn't sure until now, but I always suspected. Margaret knew and tried to stop me from finding you. Now that you're here, it all makes sense. I just wish I had more time to get to know you. Sarah felt a mix of emotions, joy, anger, confusion. What happens now? What happens to all of this? Margaret will never accept this. She doesn't have to, he replied firmly. The important thing is that you know who you are, and I'm going to make sure you get what you've always deserved. Sarah didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she had found something she had been searching for her entire life: her family. With the revelation, Sarah felt like her life had been turned upside down, but at the same time, a spark of hope was ignited within her. She finally knew the truth. She wasn't just a nurse caring for a patient. She was the daughter of a man who, despite his mistakes, wanted to make amends. However, Margaret was not about to lose control. That afternoon, she called the lawyer and tried to pressure Mr. Williams into signing the documents that would ensure that everything would remain under his control. But with a strength no one expected, he refused. I'm not signing anything until everything is clear, he declared, with a firmness that surprised even Sarah. Faced with his resistance, Margaret lost control. In a fit of rage, she revealed her true motives. Do you think she deserves anything? All of this is mine. I took care of you. I did everything for this family. And now you're going to throw it all away for some girl who just showed up? The silence that followed was deafening. The lawyer, clearly uncomfortable, gathered up the documents and left, leaving Margaret alone to face the consequences of her words. Sarah held her father's hand, feeling strengthened by his presence. No matter what happens, we're together now, she said. Over the next few days, things began to change. Mr. Williams made important decisions, ensuring that Sarah would be legally recognized as his daughter and that his will would reflect that truth. Margaret, though furious, had to accept his defeat. But that was only the beginning. Mr. Williams suggested that they create a foundation to help people who, like Sarah, had experienced hardship in life. He wanted to turn his inheritance into something meaningful, something that would unite father and daughter in a greater mission. I want others to find the hope that you brought me, Sarah, he said, holding her hand as they planned the first steps of the project. On her last day at the mansion before beginning their new journey, Sarah looked up at her father as the sun set over the gardens. I never imagined I would find my family like this, she said, overcome with emotion. Neither did I, he replied with a smile. But sometimes, it's in the most unexpected moments that we find what we need most.